For those of you who may have forgotten, FSB came out of Department of Finance, and it moved on to Rigel Avenue as the registrar of the pension fund, of capital markets, whatever, but it was called Financial Services Board, Raad op Finansiële Diens. I asked my colleagues today, I said, oh, FSCA, Financial Sector Conduct Authority, what is it called in Afrikaans? They said, we're not translating it anymore. But it just told you how concept can be difficult from time to time. When we set up the FSB, you can imagine the time spent on setting up the offices, systems. We were not as IT learned as we are today. A lot of work was done manually. And my colleagues will tell you we had a massive room somewhere at the back of the office called the storage. All the files were in that room. For you to do any work, you had to call for a file, and it will be brought to your desk, but come end of the day, that file must go back to the storeroom. So we had a whole army of people working in the storeroom, but extremely, extremely clever people who were managing that room because the files were many. But of course, the main issue at the time was we were operating from an act, a 1956 act on the retirement fund. And that act was the first act to regulate pension funds. But as we know, you put legislation in place to regulate that which is in existence. Pension Funds Act did not create pension funds. It merely wanted to regulate what was in place at the time. And what was in place at the time were called gratuity funds. Funds created by employers for their employees. And this is where the notion of defined benefit comes into play. Those funds were created voluntarily by employers for their employees, voluntarily. So, in a way, the employer felt, this is my fund for my employees, so that when they leave, I recognize their services. But for me to recognize their services, they had to comply with 3 requirements. They would have to work for me all their life. They would have to be loyal to me. And they would have to be honest to me. If they complied with the 3, I will be able to give them something. You can imagine the subjectivity covered in that. But we must not just focus on the subjectivity, but the goodwill of employers starting that type of funds. And indeed, many benefited from that. And you will be surprised that in 2018, the year 2018, we still had one of those gratuity funds in existence. And Orlando and Collier and everybody are dealing with that. But it just shows you where we come from. That was the 1991 period, the 90s. Whilst we were grappling with that in the 90s, we had to look back now. And this is where labor comes into play. Labor started saying, We have pension funds, and when our members leave pension funds, they leave their money behind. There must be a system where when members leave, they take every cent of their money and go away with it. That was the beginning of provident funds and DC funds, defined contribution funds. Jan Mahlangu is around here. He was there when that battle was fought. And indeed, it happened. This is why, even today, in the Pension Funds Act, you hardly find if there is a word provident fund. It was something that came as afterthought. But little did we realize that we were actually taking away. Employer said, by all means, but we were taking away that defined benefit facility where employers would take whatever responsibility, whatever shortfall. Those are the unintended consequences of some of the decisions taken, but they were taken in good faith at the time. Those were 1980s. But as if that was not enough, you know, organized labor in this country, sometimes you want to chop their heads off, but sometimes you want to put an extra head on them because they're helpful. Then they started talking about what did it, John? The workers' money. Why would members of these funds, why would workers not be involved in the running of their own monies in the fund? Then the whole debate started of introducing members into the management of funds. And the fight went on and on. That was achieved in 1996, when members for the first time were allowed to become trustees of funds. This is why today we can say these trustees are not qualified to do this, they don't understand this. That was phase one, to allow them to get into the system. Phase two, which FSCA and organized labor will have to work on, is to say, what kind of trustees do we want to manage these funds? And I know there are many people who are saying we're training trustees and so on and so on. And I've attended many of those training sessions where trustees are trained. Organized labor said, regulator, be careful. When service providers tell you they're training trustees, they only directing those trustees to themselves. Registrar, you must have independent institutions to train trustees. That must still be done, organized labor and FSCA. So that was the introduction of trustees in 1996. Again, whilst that was in motion, another commotion started. You know, funds submit valuation reports, and employers apply for contribution holidays and so on. I remember very well at the time, the chief actuary of the Financial Services Board was Jeremy Andrew, Mr. Andrew. He was there. And he said to me, and I was heading the pension fund space, and he said to me, you know, all the valuations that I look at, they all have extra money. Where does this money come from, and who owns this money? But of course, don't forget, the pre-1994 gratuity situation. Keep that in mind. That would have created extra money in the funds. But another thing that created extra money in the funds is the type of rules that were registered. Remember, before the 1956, you have to work there, be honest and be loyal. Now, in the new dispensation of surplus issues, there you were required to say, because now there's a pension fund, if you don't work for me all your life, the contributions that I make into the fund and you make, if you stay for 5 years, you get your own contributions and only a small part of what I contributed as an employer. So you had all those scales coming, but the money remained in the funds. And I think at the back of employers, rightly or wrongly, they thought, when everybody else has died out of this fund, I will inherit the remnants of this fund. But here is Jeremy, Andrew, and Tshidi at the FSB. So where is this money coming from? Then the issue of surplus started to surface. We started asking questions. And there were two main questions that were asked at the time. One was, who owns the surplus? Two, is there surplus anyway? But we did not have legislation to deal with that. But we knew there was surplus eventually. Well, the first two funds that were confronted on the surplus issue, Jan will recall, it was the PEP case. You know PEP stores? PEP stores had surplus. Then there was also the tech one. Today you talk of the PEP case and the tech case. But the background to it was that on the PEP one, the PEP case, the issue was who owns the surplus. But then there was a rule amendment submitted to the FSB to amend the rules of the fund to say, that is when they realized there was a huge surplus in the fund. We are now decentralizing this fund. We've got all these little funds. It's a type of umbrella. We are decentralizing it. But we are not just going to do it. We are going to incentivize the members. And they would go to Radesh. Radesh, you have 100 rand in the fund. If you move out, we give you 500 rand. Radesh said, what? Fine. I'm ready to move. And that's what they did. But collectively, that's what they dangled in front of members of the PEP fund. And indeed, they were going to decentralize that. So the amendment that was submitted to the FSB was to say, the fund is so much overfunded, which was not true. It was actually that much. But they say it's this much overfunded. All of it we are going to distribute it to members, and then we deregister the fund. But what I'm telling you now is the discussion that took place in the board meeting of the company. And they wrote that in the minutes. So when we investigated this thing, this conversation came out. We got the minutes. But unfortunately, we had registered the rule already. So when we started saying, no, what you're telling us is not true. Remember at the time it's Jeremy and I. I remember my CEO at the time and the CEO of PEP, a very strong guy who was caught in Heathrow having bags of cash money. I won't mention the name. So he went to my CEO and who's this one? What is he saying? My CEO was furious with me. And he said to me, how do you challenge the rules that the registrar had registered? And how dare you get a hold of minutes of a board of a company? Remember, he's fighting with me, and I'm holding on this white colleague of mine, Jeremy Andrew. Said, Jeremy, you must protect me now. And I must give him credit wherever he is. He protected me, and we've been friends and buddies from that day until today, because we fought together. Then, of course, the issue went to court, PEP case, we went there, we succeeded. First, of course, at the High Court, we lost everything. We went to Bloemfontein, the appellate division. There we succeeded. Then we come back. The next thing is, yeah, there is surplus, but who owns it? Tech case. Who owns it? Who gets what? Who doesn't get what? Again, another legal battle. All the way to the High Court, we lost at the High Court. Appellate division, we won. Right? Again, Mahlangu was with us. Yeah, you were with us, but that's good. And other colleagues as well. After the decisions of those two cases, then it was a question of how do we, it's here now, the surplus, how do we deal with it? There was no way to deal with it except to put legislation in place. And that is where Mr. Masilela is here as well, the surplus legislation. You remember the many hours we spent, Friday to Saturday, early hours of the morning, trying to put the surplus legislation in place. And the battles we had, the fight we had. I remember, Elias, you remember on the surplus issue, there was a day, it was Minister Manuel at the time. We were summoned to National Treasury because the American Chamber of Commerce, you remember? All the American companies were going to leave South Africa if we were going to take surplus out of the funds. Thanks God, Minister was strong. You remember he said, if you have to live for this, you're welcome. Thanks God it did not happen. But then we put the legislation in place. Elias is history, Jan Matango. We did that. That's where we are with the surplus issue. That was not the end. Bulking came. We had to battle with the bulking issue. You know bulking? I'm an administrator, I've got so many funds, and the law says every fund must have its own bank account in its own name. It doesn't matter which bank you use. Fund must have an account in its own name. Nothing wrong with that. But you know, the administrator goes to the bank and says, Mr. Bank, you see how much business I've brought to you? Many funds. Look at, and then he calculates the balances of all the funds and say, this is how much I've brought to you. What's in for me? Give me a percentage out of this, then you keep the business. That's the bulking. And they made millions. When we discovered that, we said, bring it back. It was not nice, but it came back. Right? But remember, all this money, surpluses, all these bulkings coming back, they get back into the fund, they must be distributed to the members. When you do that, well and good. Because we're talking history here, you're creating a new problem. Unclaimed benefit. Some of the people who are members of these funds have gone wherever they went. You don't know where they are. And many of them came from the rural areas or outside the borders of South Africa. And those who came within South African borders, in Limpopo, whatever, they didn't tell their families who was their employer, except when they came home in an overall written ISCO on the back or something. Then you would have thought, maybe he worked for that company. But they didn't tell anybody about it. That problem number one of not being able to trace people. Problem number two, it's private back X 56 or whatever. You know what that meant? It meant, and the new generation, you don't know how 5 roses were delivered to the shops. It was a big box, 5 roses. They would empty a box of that nature, put it in the general dealer close to any village. And that private bags extra was that box. So all the mail that came private extra was thrown in that box. What are the chances that you and that letter will come to you? It didn't matter how much the fund tried to communicate with you. It was there. And I was naughty myself. I was at a boarding school where we were not allowed to do anything, but we would be given a walk on one Sunday saying, take a walk to that shop and buy something and come back. So we would go there and the box will be there. Say, do I have a letter in this box? So you look at that. But all the letters that looked like they were personal, we took them so that we go and read. I was that naughty. But I'm just demonstrating to you how people could not be reached for unclaimed benefit until today. But you know, journalists, the people who write newspapers today, and the champions of unclaimed benefit, they make all this noise as if they know where these things come from. They've got no idea. No idea. They just, surplus, people's money. What people's money? You don't know where it comes from. Ask, we will help you. Why we have unclaimed benefits. Now, the other notion that we had to deal with was this notion of contribution holiday. And you know, FSB was in litigation on this contribution holiday. We are still in litigation on it, FSCA. Because some employers said, if I could apply for contribution holiday, I may as well have taken the money, Musne. And some of them did. Now we say, there's no thing called contribution holiday. It simply says, because there is enough money in here, just wait a bit, don't put more money in here, you're causing confusion, wait a little bit. So I'm on holiday, he tells people. So I'm taking it. So we are in litigation about that. So we wanted to just clarify all these things. Now, that is the part of the FSB. With all these things happening, National Treasury is here, I think. They were concocting another angle called Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks, eh? But of course, Twin Peaks, Elias would know, is an afterthought. We actually wanted one peak at some stage, but there were some power dynamics. So something had to be worked out to deal with the power dynamics, so Twin Peaks. Okay, so Twin Peaks discussion started 2011. 2011, Twin Peaks started the discussions. And they went on and on and on, putting legislation in place until finally we say, come April 2018, we kick off Twin Peaks. That's where we are. But of course, this Twin Peaks, I've told Orlando, my new boss, that, you know, Orlando, the timing is perfect because I don't want to give Rousseau more gray hair. Funny? More gray hair. Yeah, you came with black hair, no? Because this Twin Peaks Act says, Registrar, from now on, all along you've been reacting. The damage would happen, and you would come running and say, who caused the damage, and how do we fix the damage? Twin Peaks says, stop with that. You need to preempt the damage. You need to preempt it. Once you've done that, you need to proactively work on that and do it in a very, very forward-looking way. That is what is causing me nightmares when I'm asleep, Makubela. But I guess people who are IT educated will say, no, information will come, this thing will tell me what is likely to happen. So that is the requirement for a new regulator. Preemptive, proactive, forward-looking. Now, how does the regulator do that? Of course, regulator must be intrusive. You must sniff around and try to get as much information as you can. And when you sniff around, you must be intensive. Be intensive in whatever you're doing and be efficient. The days of just asking for information because the law says you shall submit information are over. You only have to get that information that you need and information that matters, and communicate that clearly to the trustees of the various funds. And this requirement of preemptive, proactive, forward-looking, I don't think is confined only to the regulator. You trustees of funds, you have exactly the same requirement. You've got to make sure that you foresee things, you prevent the damage from happening, and all. If for instance, you want to appoint an asset manager, and I come and pose as an asset manager, how do you engage me and appoint me as your asset manager without knowing who I am? What is it that I can deliver? So you need to apply your mind to that as well. But then it goes on to say, you as a trustee, it means members of the fund that you are a trustee of, they looked around and then they said, you know, this guy this lady, we trust this person. We trust this person. So, in other words, they took their trust and planted in you. Their trust planted in you. Now, because of the seriousness of this, you must ask yourself before you accept becoming a trustee. And I've been drilling this in Makubela's head. Make sure you are trustworthy yourself. And the answer lies with you. I can't tell you whether you are trustworthy or not. You know yourself. Sit down, ask yourself, am I trustworthy? You will be honored. History will honor you, and generations to come will honor you if you stand up and say, I am not that trustworthy. Go next door. Why am I saying this is because remember when people put their whole trust in you, you become them. Because they've taken their trust in you, you become them. So, when you appoint fund administrator, asset manager, whoever, you must use the trust of the members of the fund, the trust that they've put in you. If you use your own trust, there's a problem. They have given you their trust, use that trust. Because your trust, depending on how trustworthy you are, may be questioned. And you don't want to be questioned because all these members are asking from you is, look after our savings so that when we retire, you don't call us to a meeting to explain to us how much mistakes you have made. All we want is for you to pay us what we deserve to get on a monthly basis. I think I've done my part, Mr. Makubela. Thank you very much and enjoy your part.